Hi, how y'all doing? My name's Tyler. I'm the Vice President of the Wilton College Republicans.
And I'm Leslie Lovett. I'm the Secretary of Affairs here.
And today with us we have Mr. Kris Wampler. He is an attorney in Indian Land and he's running for U.S. Congress. So thanks for coming out today.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes.
So to start off this interview, we're just going to ask you, how did you get involved in the law?
So I went to law school originally to become a constitutional lawyer, actually, which is kind of funny because that plays into my campaign theme a lot. But I wanted to do con law, which is basically free speech, freedom of religion, the Bill of Rights, that kind of stuff. That was why I went to law school. After I got into law school, I realized that there's about 5 people in the country who do con law. So I was like, okay, so I kind of wish I had known that going in, that it's not exactly something you can do, unless you're about 70 years old and have been a professor for about 50 years. So I got into it anyway, and I was like, you know what, I still like law because, quite honestly, I like to argue. I mean, I like to have debates, I like to argue. I did a lot of that in college. So I ended up doing family law, more or less just by coincidence. I got in touch with somebody from Wake Forest University, where I went to law school, and she brought me in and taught me family law, and that's what I do today.
Yes.
That is awesome. So what made you decide to run from that kind of transition?
Sure. Well, when I heard about the opening, I had talked with a couple of friends, and it was kind of at first just sort of saying, oh, I wonder if I should run for this seat, just to see how, just to kind of throw it out there. And then actually it was my campaign manager, Eric Fileski, who messaged me directly one day, and he said, if you decide to run, my wife and I will come up and support you and help you out. And his wife, of course, is here today with us. She's my communications director. And I wrote him back and I said, well, you and I have some different opinions. I mean, he's a little more to the left than I am on some things. And I said, so what made you say that? And he said, well, honestly, you seem to have integrity, you seem to have conviction, you have your principles, you're very consistent with all that, and I think you'd make a good representative, even though I don't agree with you on everything. So that's really what kind of spurred me to getting into this, and after I got that communication from him, I said, let's do it. Let's put together a team. Let's start reaching out to everybody, just like we started reaching out to you guys, and that's kind of where we are now.
So then, going into your actual run, what issues are most important to you?
Sure. 2 things mainly. The Constitution is extremely important to me. I think we take an oath to the Constitution as congressmen, as senators, as the president. Everybody in the federal government takes an oath to the Constitution, and I think that looking back over the last few years, I think we've seen that the Republican Party has often kind of strayed from that. The Republican Party has gotten to be to the point where, on a lot of issues, they're simply for smaller government when compared to the Democrats, which is not much difference. I want the Republican Party to be the party of limited government. I'm a Ron Paul Republican. I think that when Ron Paul ran, he emphasized the Constitution and limiting government to what the federal government is empowered to do and nothing else. So that's my main theme, is if it's in the Constitution, if it's authorized by the Constitution, that's fine, I'll vote for it. But even beyond that, even if it's something that is constitutional, let's look at maybe ways we can save spending, save money even more. And the ultimate kind of goal of all of this is that the government, the federal government, can't run your lives. Yeah. I mean, it's not empowered to do that. Washington can't do it. There's already enough problems at the local level, I think, in South Carolina versus Columbia, versus that struggle for power and that struggle for control. It's obviously a lot greater with people in the local communities versus the federal government. So, my message to people is Washington cannot run your lives. They just can't. You should be running your lives. You know what's best for you. You know how to do it. And I want to return money and power to the local communities so they can do that.
That's great. And I just want to point, I was a Ron Paul conservative also.
There you go.
That's my first connection to politics was working with the Ron Paul campaign in 2011, just doing phone calls. And then
I'm in good company then, so
yeah.
Good to know that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and there's a lot of there's a lot of specific things that kind of come from that. I mean, some of the other candidates are talking about they want to go and fix Washington. They want to repair Washington. It's broken. They want to repair. I don't want to repair it. I want to get it out of your lives. And there's different ways to do that. And I'll give you just a couple specific issues. One of them is, we hear about repealing and replacing Obamacare. I just want to repeal Obamacare. I don't want to replace it with anything. Because if you put another law in place, when a Democrat gets in there one day, which there'll be another Democratic administration, the regulatory state is going to go and change that law, and it's going to, issue orders, and there'll be executive orders, and they'll change it back, and we'll be probably in the same place we are now. We need to get the federal government's hands off of healthcare entirely. Same with education. I want the education department to be abolished. I don't think that they're in any position to run education. I think they do a terrible job at it. Yeah. And so my campaign theme and the issues that I stand for are kind of tracked along that position. Very limited government. If it's not in the Constitution, get rid of it. If it is in the Constitution, let's still see if we can save money and turn some power back over to the people.
I really appreciate you saying just repeal and not repeal and replace, because everybody says that 10th Amendment and limited government, but then they're submitting legislation that's replacing Obamacare and not just repealing
exactly.
it. But how would you, moving on, how would you contribute to limited government?
Sure.
What kind of legislation would you introduce to?
Well, there's already legislation right now to actually abolish the Department of Education. I believe it's Representative Amash.
It's one sentence, I think.
Yeah, it's a one sentence. It just basically says no more Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously I would sponsor and co-sponsor that kind of legislation. There's also something, and this is not something you hear a whole lot about. It doesn't get talked a lot about. Article 3 of the Constitution actually allows Congress to limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And a lot of people say, well, what does that mean? Well, the Supreme Court in our Constitution has original jurisdiction over certain matters. In other words, they go straight to the Supreme Court. They have the power to hear it, etc. Everything else that's not listed in there is appellate. And that's why you hear about, I'll give you an example. A school prayer case that starts out at the local level will eventually make its way through the federal courts, will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. It's that appellate jurisdiction that allows the Supreme Court to hear cases like school prayer or like other issues. In my mind, no matter who we have on the Supreme Court, whether it's Gorsuch or whoever, there's always going to be a risk that we're going to get something handed down on some issue that really should remain in the local communities, and it might not be a good decision. I think with Gorsuch, I think it'll be a 5-4 conservative, balance, but that's including Kennedy, and he's a swing vote. So, Congress has the ability to basically say to the Supreme Court, you're not going to hear certain cases. And this was actually tried back in the late 70s by Senator Jesse Helms, who is from, my home state of North Carolina, but he tried to introduce something to limit the Supreme Court from hearing school prayer cases. It ultimately didn't pass because it was part of a larger budget, etc., or a larger bill. But I want to take away the power of the Supreme Court to be making these decisions that really just, they shouldn't be involved with. I mean, the Supreme Court should have very limited power. It should not be a legislature, and I think we have allowed it to become that. So invoking Congress's Article 3 power to take away certain issues that can be heard by a Supreme Court, I mean, no one else in the campaign is talking about that. That's an issue that you're only going to hear from my campaign. Again, along with sponsoring and co-sponsoring legislation that's going to abolish or get rid of programs, and further, just saying no to certain things that come up, and having the courage and conviction to say that, no matter who proposes it. Again, Republican, Democrat, if it's not in the Constitution, my answer is no.
So now let's talk about something that everyone else in the campaign is talking about, and you have a different opinion on, is term limits.
Yes.
A lot of people think that, have been saying that the way to fix Washington is term limits, but you have a different opinion. So what's your opinion on term limits?
So I think we already have term limits. It's called voting. If you don't like who's in office, vote them out. And it works for general elections, and it works for primary elections. We saw a number of years ago where the Tea Party mounted several challenges to incumbent Republicans who had been in there for years. And some of them were successful and some weren't. But some of these candidates, these new people that came into young guns, as they called them in some cases, the Tea Party young guns, they were able to knock out people who had been in office, who had been Republicans for years. And it was because the people came out and voted. So we already have term limits. It's called voting. And there's a lot of other issues. I mean, for example, you don't know who's going to come in after you. It could be just the same kind of person that's going to come in there. What happens to things like seniority and rank? What happens with committee assignments, because those usually have to do with seniority and rank. I think that causes some confusion. There's going to be an issue of, okay, how many terms? I think that the younger people, newly minted congressmen and senators are going to want a few terms. some of the ones who have been in there since the dawn of time, they're going to probably want about 2,000 terms as term limits. So there's not going to be any agreement on that. Now, U.S. term limits, that's the biggest group out there kind of pushing this. They're pushing for what's called an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. It's called a CONCON. And the reason they're pushing for that is they know that Congress itself is never going to pass it. I think it would be unconstitutional, actually, because the Congress clearly says you can vote for your senators and congressmen every 6 and 2 years. Clearly, Congress is not going to send a constitutional amendment to the states, so they want the state legislatures to call a constitutional convention. It's never been done before in the United States. And the reason that it's a dangerous idea is that there's no way to limit a constitutional convention to one single issue. They think they can. They think we can call this thing and have it and just limit it to term limits and that's it. But a lot of legal experts say that if one of these Article 5 conventions is called, that other issues could come up. And it could be anything from abortion to gay rights to gay marriage to things that affect religious liberty, gun rights. It could be anything. And what you might end up with are proposals to amend the Constitution that we're not going to like as limited government people, as constitutionalists. So I think you're opening a Pandora's box with this. I think it's a very dangerous thing to get something that is not necessary. Again, if you don't like the person in office, vote him out. I'm a no on term limits. I don't think they're necessary. I think they're more dangerous than they are good.
All right. Well, can you tell us something about you that you liked about Mick Mulvaney and what you would continue that he kind of pushed in Congress?
So Mick Mulvaney was a pretty strong advocate for limited government. I think he was a member of the House Freedom Caucus. He may have been even a founding member. I'm not sure. What I liked about him and what kind of came up during the confirmation hearing was that he's very consistent when it comes to things like cutting spending. Now, we come from a state that does have a high, we have, military population here and everything like that. Mick, though, when they were talking about cutting spending a number of years ago, obviously, the Pentagon and the John McCains of the world and some of the Armed Forces Committee type people, they wanted to leave the defense budget out of it. And Mick Mulvaney said very clearly, defense, like everything else, should be looked at for spending cuts. I mean, he was consistent about that. He wasn't willing to leave anything off the table. So he is somebody who comes across to me. I've not met him. I've not had the privilege of meeting him, but he's very principled. He's very consistent, and I think that he's a very limited government kind of guy. I think if you actually examine my positions when lined up against the other 6 or 7 or 18 people, however many we have in a race, I think you're going to find that mine are most closely aligned with him. Fiscally very conservative and getting the government out of people's lives and, abiding by the Constitution. So I like the fact that he's consistent and that he's a champion of the Constitution.
So turning to a more personal portion of this interview, what is something about you that not many people know?
Well, a couple things I guess I'll say. I did sue my university when I came into Chapel Hill, actually. I sued them based on a reading program that we had that I thought violated the First Amendment. We got a lot of press out of that, although I was anonymous for a couple of years because the group that represented me got death threats and everything else for filing a lawsuit. But more than that, I have 2 kids, 2 sheepdogs that I have, Old English sheepdogs. They're just like giant bears, basically, when you look at them, and they're the cutest things in the world. Very lovable dogs. I also play guitar. I play acoustic guitar. I can play a couple songs from Pearl Jam to Alice in Chains, a little bit of Johnny Cash, a little bit of Neil Young. So I kind of span a few generations on my ability to play. I think those are a couple things, and I'm always down to jam with people on guitar anytime they want to.
I'm pretty sure Tommy Pope can rap, so I mean, if you guys want to get to in.
Yeah, it's funny when he called me up actually. He left a message before his announcement. He said, "I see you're a fan of rock and classic rock." He said, "Maybe we can jam sometime." I'm thinking, well, I know we got a busy schedule ahead of us, but I would love to do that sometime. Absolutely.
That's great.
That's good.
Yeah.
What would your message be to young voters?
So, I think that a lot of the younger people coming up have cynicism for government, for the politicians, for their elected leaders. I think they look at Washington as an institution, and there's not a lot of trust there. I think that there's not a lot of trust for politicians because they say one thing and then they get in the office and then they do something else. I think you may see that with people who promise term limits. Term limits have kind of been around for a long time, and there have been congressmen who get in there who say, oh, I'm all about term limits, and they get in there and they violate it. Even with, I signed the Taxpayer Protection Pledge. I don't know, except for Sherry Few, I don't know if there's anybody else that's really even signed that. But even that pledge, which is kind of the gold standard for politicians who want to limit taxes, a lot of congressmen violate that. And that's why I think there's sort of this, and I felt it too growing up, when I was in college, a lot of mistrust for, the institutions, a lot of mistrust for the leaders and so forth. With me, though, it's always going to be clear where I am. I'm with the Constitution. If it's not authorized, I'm not voting for it. A lot of, I saw a lot of the cynicism, coming up and everything. So I think that people, when they look at my campaign and look at the things I stand for, it's very consistent. There's a very consistent theme. It's that I want to limit government to within the bounds of the Constitution and the enumerated powers that are given to the federal government by the 10th Amendment. And if it's outside of that, the answer is no. So lobbyists aren't going to come bother me probably. I don't know why they would, because I'm not voting for their pet projects. If some lobbyist wants to come up and have me vote to give money for some kind of funding project that they want, for some healthcare initiative that they want, my answer is the federal government has no business doing this. Healthcare or any of a number of other issues, education, energy policy. I think that needs to be left to the states as well. So you're always going to know where I stand because I stand with the Constitution. And I'm hoping to get, obviously the younger voters. I'm the youngest guy in the race, so I'm hoping that resonates with them.
Well, thank you so much for coming out and doing this interview with us. We're looking forward to having you again at our forum on March 30th, so thank you for coming out. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate it, Leslie.
Yes.
Thank you so much.